Good evening. I was about to say good morning. It's morning here in the UK. So as Janet said, I'm going to speak to you a little bit about prostitution policy in New Zealand and why it's been an abject failure in protecting women and girls. Okay, so the Prostitution Reform Act in New Zealand was passed in June 2003. So this has been in effect now for 20 years. It's largely known, particularly by the pro-prostitution lobbies, as full decriminalisation. In effect, it's not really any different from the legalisation model. It's just in some areas there are slightly less regulations. So what that did, buying and selling sex, I believe, in at least some instances, was already legal in New Zealand. So what this law did was to make third-party facilitation legal. Now, me and you would probably know that as pimping. So what this law does is allow for the running of escort agencies. It allows for licensed brothels. They're able to apply to the government for a valid operator's license. There are still local bylaws in place that regulate advertising of the sex industry, the location of brothels and street prostitution. There are fines in place for not practicing safe sex of up to £2,000. So brothel owners who are not enforcing condom use can be fined up to £2,000. Also, in theory, it was made explicitly illegal to buy sex from minors, so children. And I'll come back to this at the end because unfortunately that is not what's happening. Okay, the stated aims of the Prostitution Reform Act, and this is taken directly from the New Zealand government's website. So the stated aims of introducing this law was to safeguard the human rights of sex workers. And I'll just say, I don't personally use the term sex worker as a sex trade survivor. I think it's exploitation, but I'm reading directly from the New Zealand government material. Okay, so safeguarding the human rights of sex workers, protecting sex workers from exploitation, promoting the welfare and occupational safety and health of sex workers, creating an environment conducive to public health, and protecting children from exploitation in relation to prostitution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the evidence that we have on the Prostitution Reform Act and how it's pretty much failed to meet any of those stated aims. Now, there was a report on the reform done in 2008. So it was a 5-year report, and the conclusion of the report, and I'm reading directly from the New Zealand government materials. On the whole, the Prostitution Reform Act has been effective in achieving its purpose, and the committee is confident that the vast majority of people involved in the sex industry are better off under the PRA than they were previously. However, it was noted that progress in some areas had been slow. For instance, many sex workers were still vulnerable to exploitative employment conditions. I'll just leave that there. I'm sure you can imagine what exploitative employment conditions in the sex trade would look like. There have also been reports of some sex workers being forced to take clients against their will. This would otherwise be known as rape. The committee said that an assessment of the PRA's impact should be undertaken at a later date to evaluate whether the Act is in fact achieving its purpose. And so there was supposed to be a second report, a 15-year report made in 2018, which didn't materialise. Okay, but to come back to the 2008 report, so this is the report that's generally trotted out, or at least the conclusion is trotted out by pro-prostitution groups to show that this is the model that works. This is the model that sex workers want. When we actually have a look at the report itself, and not just the conclusion, the data that's given does not match the conclusion. I'm just going to take you through a few points. So when it says the vast majority of people in the sex trade, so there were 772 participants in the report, which is not a bad sample size. The estimate at the time was that there were at least 6,000 people in the sex trade. However, these participants were not randomly selected. They were sourced partly, if not mostly, through the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, which is the major lobby group for sex workers' work in New Zealand, currently headed, I believe, by Dame Catherine Healy, who was an awarded an OBE for her services in helping this law come to fruition. Okay, and so 772 participants were given a short questionnaire, and the report does not show us the questionnaires. We don't know the questions that were asked or how the data was gathered. Of these, 58 were interviewed in depth in NZPC offices. So they were interviewed by the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective and sourced by them. So we already have a very skewed sample of people in the sex trade who are already in touch with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. and are therefore already likely to support full decriminalisation. There were 40 interviews with NGO staff. Again, all of these NGOs are pro-prostitution, and 38 interviews with brothel owners themselves. So brothel owners were allowed an input into the report. The report admits, in its very first pages, that those who are most vulnerable to exploitation are very unlikely to be represented in this report. So in effect, this report is showing us the absolute best case scenario. And I'll be putting a link to the report on my website, as I said, so you can have a look for yourself if you want to have a read through that. So the claim that people in the sex trade are better off, I'm now going to quote directly from the report. Okay, so on page 152, it states that the levels of stigma towards people in the sex trade has not changed. On page 153, exploitative brothels are, according to the women that are exploited in them, still just as exploitative. Brothel owners set the fees, including all-inclusive. For any of you who don't know what an all-inclusive is, it basically allows the punter to pay a flat fee. I believe in the UK at least around £50 is, considered the average. So the punter pays a flat fee, in which case he's able to choose any woman in the brothel that he likes to effectively do whatever he chooses. So of course this is exploitation. There's absolutely no agency for that woman at all. On page 155, there are no employee or workers' rights in practice because, of course, sex sellers are classed as independent contractors. They're not allowed to bring grievance actions. So the idea that full decriminalisation or legalisation gives people in the sex trade any kind of workers' rights is in effect a myth. Page 160, the committee, which largely includes the NZPC, decides that the answer to these problems are more government-funded NGOs who can broker for sex workers. Well, I mean, of course they do. There is a huge profit motive in this. On page 163, relationships between prostitution and criminal activity has not altered. Now, the report doesn't really explain what it means by that, what criminal activity here we're talking about. So that's fairly ambiguous. On page 45, there is still little right in practice to refuse clients. And remember, this is coming from women in the sex trade who are likely to be pro-decrim or at least neutral because they're involved with the NZPC, and they are directly telling us that in practice they have little right to refuse clients, punters. Page 46 gives us some data. 41% of street sellers, 37% of people in brothels, and 29% of independent escorts have had to see clients that they have tried to refuse. This is rape. There's no beating around the bush with this. This is rape. And on page 47, to tackle this, particularly in brothels, the committee advises handing out educational materials to the brothel owners. So apparently giving a pimp a leaflet on consent is going to solve that problem. Now, on page 56 of the report, there's a really strange statistic where it states, directly independently of that data that I've just read out, that 5% of those interviewed have been raped. Now, this directly contradicts figures above. I don't think I should have to explain to any woman, any feminist, anyone with any ounce of common sense that if you're having to see a punter that you're trying to refuse, that's already rape. So how we've gone from 41% to 5% in the space of a few pages is never explained. My best guess would be that 5% refers to particularly physically violent rape, but it doesn't explain that. But it's a direct contradiction. And then on page 58, we have the admission that violence is happening at the same rates and is still not being reported to the police. One of the big sells for pro-prostitution lobby is that by legalising/decriminalising women in the sex trade who experience violence will be more likely to report to the police. The report shows that has not happened. Okay, in terms of the long-term impact then, as I said, the promised 15-year 2018 review has never materialised. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why that may be. So in 2021, SASE UK, Stand Against Sexual Exploitation, made a number of freedom of information requests to the New Zealand government and put the data into a report of their own. And again, I will link the report in the presentation, which will be available on my website. So bear in mind that this report from 2021, so it's quite recently, and it's been put together directly from freedom of information requests from the New Zealand government, a lot of which comes through the NZPC. So NZPC data indicates a threefold increase in prostitution across New Zealand. So we've gone from an estimate of 6,000 people, predominantly women and girls in the sex trade, to 18,000. There's been a tenfold increase in street prostitution in Auckland of predominantly Indigenous women and girls, so the most vulnerable. The government does not monitor the NZPC as was initially stated, and the NZP has not fulfilled the mandated requirements to provide information. So this information that we have is incredibly patchy. Again, we're probably getting the absolute best case scenario here, and it's already horrible. The mandated inspections of licensed brothels aren't happening. There's only been 11 in a decade. So it's become incredibly difficult for the police to detect trafficking or to do anything about their suspicions. In 2016, the NZPC said, and this is a direct quote from the mouth of an NZPC spokesperson, regardless of the law, it is impossible to stop the violence. So when pro-prostitution lobbyists try to tell us that full decriminalisation is the only way to keep women safe, we have the proof here in black and white that that is completely untrue. NZPC reports show that there are frequent complaints of violence and coercion, and yet few police reports are made, and there have only been a handful of convictions. I was only able to find myself records for two convictions in 20 years. Okay, absolutely no funding has ever been allocated for exit support. Those of you familiar with the Nordic model, which most sex trade survivors and feminists support, which completely decriminalises those selling sex, those coerced or forced into the sex trade, whether by poverty or a third party or anything else, criminalises pimps and buyers, and also has a huge push towards outreach and exit, so getting women out. Under full decriminalisation, that doesn't happen because it's seen as a job like any other. Why would exit supports be set up? You know, and I've actually heard this argument directly from pro-prostitution lobbyists that we don't have exit organisations for plumbers, so why should we have them for sex workers? Which is a completely ludicrous argument, but this is where this goes. NZPC reports from 2010 indicate that the mental health of those selling sex was urgent, and several women in the past few years, in the run up to 2010, had committed suicide. Also, I didn't actually make a note of this, but I looked into this recently, and the rates of murders in women in the sex trade haven't gone down since full decriminalisation either. In fact, they've slightly gone up. It's obviously very hard to draw a direct correlation to the law itself because prostitution is inherently violent, but it certainly hasn't reduced them. And yet apparently this law, the model of full decriminalisation, is the law that sex workers allegedly want, according to pro-prostitution lobbyists. And so that's the data that we have on full decriminalisation. Something I wanted to point out is that quite often you will find that full decriminalisation, it's argued, is a separate model from legalisation. And in effect, in practice, they're not particularly different. Full decriminalisation essentially is legalisation with just slightly less regulation. There always has to be some regulations. So in New Zealand, brothels still have to be licensed. There are still bylaws, as we discussed. The governments are still benefiting from the industry. And so a fully decriminalised regime is impossible. If you were to remove all laws concerning prostitution, you would have to remove all protections, for example, from minors. You know, they wouldn't be able to implement the fines for not enforcing condom use in brothels. So in reality, there's very little difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. And I think the reason for this argument has come about because countries that have legalised, such as Germany and the Netherlands, have seen huge increases in trafficking, in violence. Germany has a horrendous rate of murders of women in the sex trade, horrendous rates of violence. And so what the pro-prostitution lobby have tried to do is distance themselves by calling their preferred model full decriminalisation. They're not in practice very different. And in fact, Tim Barner MP, who was largely responsible for bringing in full decriminalisation into the New Zealand Parliament on a private member's bill, which passed by one vote, has previously referred to the laws in Germany and the Netherlands as decriminalisation. So this shift in language is actually quite new. So that's worth, if you're ever having a discussion about the different models, it's worth remembering that in practice they're really not very different. To give you an example of what full decriminalisation would mean, so in the UK, the pro-prostitution lobby argues heavily for the introduction of the New Zealand model here. And what that would mean is removing all of our laws, including our 2010 law, which makes it illegal to buy sex from a trafficked person. So under full decriminalisation, even that protection would be taken away in theory. Two more points I wanted to touch on that come out strongly in the 2008 report and also have wider implications for legalising the sex trade in general. So the issue of public health, this is perhaps the one area in which full decriminalisation or legalisation can said to be in any way effective, in that there are reports that show that condom use does go up. Now, it's worth noting that a huge amount of the funding for the promotion of the legalisation of prostitution comes from UN AIDS, from various AIDS organisations, through Amnesty International, through the World Health Organization, largely around the argument around AIDS. And of course this is important, of course safe sex is important, and cutting rates of STIs and particularly bloodborne viruses is important. However, you have to weigh up the costs here. We have increased trafficking, we have increased violence, we have it being made illegal for women's bodies to be turned into commodities for the desires of men. 99.9% of punters are men, if not 100%. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit to you from a Julie Bindel article, which, if you can find, it's called the Great AIDS Swindle, I believe, and provides a much broader picture than I'm able to give here on the links between the pro-prostitution lobby and the AIDS NGOs. In the early days of the AIDS crisis in the mid-1980s, money was provided to two distinct groups in the global north: men who have sex with men and women involved in street prostitution. As a consequence, many projects devoted to HIV prevention and treatment were managed by gay men, including those with a client base consisting of women in the sex trade. So it's largely gay, and these days they're called queer, organisations that push this. And it probably won't surprise any of you to know that there are huge links between the queer/trans ideology and sex workers' work ideology. They go hand in hand. And just to give you a couple of interesting facts to shed some light on this, Alexandra Gill, who was the vice president of the NSWP, which is the international umbrella organisation for those who promote sex work, so it includes the NZPC. She was also the co-chair of the UN AIDS advisory group on HIV and sex work. So she was largely responsible for advising UN AIDS and Amnesty International on their support for full decriminalisation. She is currently serving a 15-year sentence in South America for sex trafficking. In New Zealand itself, Tim Barnett MP, who, as I said, brought in the PRA on his members' bill, has extensive links to pro-prostitution orgs in the UK. And after retirement, he took up very well-paid roles in South African AIDS organisations. So this is a huge topic, and there are so many links. So if you're interested, I would urge you to go and check out that Julie Bindel article. The last point I wanted to make about why this has been a complete abject failure in terms of protecting women and children in any way is in the exploitation of minors. So in theory, there were supposed to be strengthened laws around protecting minors from being exploited in the sex trade. That hasn't happened. In the 2008 report directly refers to exploited minors as sex workers and underage sex workers. The men who pay to exploit them are referred to as clients. The NZPC advocates a completely hands-off approach to arresting the buyers of children. On page 101, the police admit that finding exploitation is more difficult since the law changed because police are advised by the NGOs to take this hands-off approach. And in 2012, the US called out New Zealand for its lax trafficking laws and for its increasing rates of domestic child sexual exploitation. This predominantly involves Indigenous Maori children. So the most vulnerable are being thrown completely under the bus. This is something that absolutely infuriates me. I come from an Indigenous ethnic minority myself, who are also at incredibly high risk of sex trafficking. And I see this over and over again with the pro-prostitution lobby. They claim to be progressive. They claim to speak for the marginalised. In actual fact, they're completely thrown under the bus. To leave you on hopefully a slightly more hopeful note, there are some fantastic sex trade survivors in Australia and New Zealand who are speaking out about this and about the impact that this law has had. If you're interested, I direct you towards a group called Wahine Toa Rising, which is specifically for Indigenous women and girls who have been exploited in the sex trade. It's run by Indigenous women. To Chelsea Gebbs, who spent 20 years in New Zealand's legal brothels. and to Sabrina Valise, who has a really interesting story. So she spent 25 years in the sex trade in Australia and New Zealand, and she originally helped to campaign for full decriminalisation until she experienced it. And so she has a really interesting view on this that she's experienced both before the law and after the law, and is absolutely against full decriminalisation, as you can imagine. So I hope that's given you a little snapshot on why this law has been an absolute abject failure. And as I say, I will provide the links if you want to look at this in any more detail. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was a truly horrific picture. And it's so important that that's available to the public so we can share the recording of your presentation. We're watching decriminalisation roll out across Australia at the moment.
Yeah.
And everything you're describing is like my worst nightmare.
It is mind-blowing when you look at it that this is being pushed in the way that it is.
Yeah. It's just gutting. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your work.